Hello and welcome to Transport in Mammals. Okay, so what is the role of the circulatory system in organisms? It's to move things around, and all kinds of things. It's to move fluid around, it's to move nutrients around, it's to push waste out, okay? It's to move things around the body. Okay, we're going to talk about an artificial heart later on, and you will have opportunity to click links and watch videos. I have a ton of videos in this lecture, and so I encourage you to go on to Schoology and go through. I'm not going to, we're not going to watch all of the videos that I have linked in this lecture, but I encourage you to do that. Okay, so again, exchange of materials. Animal cells exchange material across their cell membrane. And we've learned all about this. This is how we get fuel for energy, nutrients, oxygen, waste moves in and out of our blood system. And if you are a one-cell organism, that's super easy. This is done through diffusion. However, diffusion is not adequate for moving material across more than one cell barrier. So if you have more than one cell, and the more complex you get, the more types of things you need to move across cells. And diffusion, as we have learned, is not enough. So in circulation, plenty of things need to be transported. Nutrients, sugars, fuels from the digestive system, respiratory gases like O2 and CO2, from and to gas exchange systems like lungs or gills if you're a fish or other types of animals. Intracellular waste, so waste products from cells, water, salts, nitrogenous wastes. Also protective agents like immune defenses, so white blood cells and antibodies, blood clotting agents, as well as regulatory molecules like hormones. So a lot gets transported in blood. Okay, so circulatory systems can be open and closed. All animals have circulatory fluid, which would be blood, okay? Tubes to carry the circulatory fluid in, which would be blood vessels, and some kind of muscular pump, like a heart, okay? So we talked about this in class a little bit. When you're looking at like a hemolymph, okay, they have an open circulatory system. The hemolymph is the fluid, okay, and it's in and around, pumping in and around the body, and it is not separated, the blood is not separated from the other types of lymph fluid. Okay, where you have closed, where blood is separated from other interstitial fluids. Okay, so in the case of an open circulatory system, like in invertebrates, okay, so insects or arthropods, again, there's no separation between blood and interstitial fluid. So it's watery fluid of ions, dissolved solutes that bathes and surrounds all cells, as well as the blood, which then it's called hemolymph, okay, because it's both the blood and the interstitial fluid. And remember, interstitial fluid is just other types of fluids besides blood, okay? Other cellular fluids. And in a closed circulatory system, like invertebrates, earthworms, squid, and octopi, invertebrates, blood is confined to vessels and separated from interstitial fluid. So these animals can have one or more hearts. They tend to have large vessels and range from large to small vessels. And material diffuses between blood vessels and the interstitial fluid. Okay, so things will move between these, between the blood and between the interstitial fluid through capillaries, capillary beds and whatnot. Okay, so a closed system means higher pressure. Okay, so the vertebrate circulatory system, there have been adaptations, several adaptations in the closed system, and really that one of the major adaptations is the number of heart chambers. So here you're looking at the circulatory system of a fish, an amphibian, and a mammal, and you can see that the system differs. Okay, so if you're looking at the pump between the fish, the amphibian, and the mammal, as well as the capillary beds, the deoxygenated blood in blue and the oxygenated blood in red. Okay, let's take another look at this. So here you see that there are two heart chambers in the fish. There are 3 in the amphibian, and there are 4 in the mammal. Okay, so what do heart chambers do? So in the fish, there's a low pressure to the body. You have 2 chambers, and it's moving blood, so in both cases you can see it's moving deoxygenated blood out. It's moving through the capillaries, becoming oxygenated, coming down, up through into the gill capillaries, coming down into the body, which is the systemic capillaries, and then back into the heart. Okay, so there's low pressure to the body. In the next one, there's low oxygen to the body in the amphibian. Okay, and then in the mammal, there's high pressure and high oxygen to the body. So a 4-chamber heart is double pump. It separates oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood, and it maintains high pressure, okay, which is really important in larger organisms to get blood all the way around the whole animal. So again, looking at another sort of evolution of vertebrate circulatory system from the 2-chamber and from the 3-chamber all the way up to the 4-chamber circulatory system. Okay, so the vertebrate cardiovascular system, 4-chambered heart. Okay, there's 2 atria, or atrium singular, which receive blood into the heart. 2 ventricles, which pump blood out of the heart. There are blood vessels. Okay, arteries carry blood away from the heart, and they branch into smaller arterioles. And veins return blood to the heart and branch into smaller venules. And then there are capillaries, and these are extremely thin-walled vessels. Their walls are about approximately 1 cell thick, and this is where exchange happens of materials through simple diffusion. And we're going to go into more detail about all of these. And they spread out to form capillary beds, which are networks of capillaries. Okay, so here you can see the artery in red. This is coming down, branching off into the thinner and smaller atriole, which then branches even into the smaller capillaries. Okay, moving into the venule and then into the vein. You can see that those different tissues in the arteries and in the veins, there's connective tissue on the outside, smooth muscle in between, and then the endothelium in the middle. Okay, and in the vein, you can see there's the connective tissue, the smooth muscle, and the endothelium, similarly to the artery, but then there's, on the inside, you'll see there that there are valves, okay? And we'll get into more about what those valves do. So this is a real hand specimen that's been injected with a dyed plastic, and it really gives a rare and incredible glimpse at our amazing network of blood vessels and how much blood our tissues and organs need to function as they do. Here there's a link for the blood vessel structure and functions for Crash Course. All of these are really great videos. There's approximately 6, I believe, for the heart. There's 2 for the heart and 2 for blood. And then I think there's 2 more for the respiratory system. And I highly recommend watching those. They're pretty long. They're 10 to 15 minutes, so we're not going to watch them now. but I recommend you watching them. Okay, so let's start with arteries. Arteries are built for high pressure. They have thicker walls, which provide strength for high pressure of pumping blood. They have a narrower diameter, and they have a high level of elasticity. So they have this elastic recoil, which really helps them maintain blood pressure even when the heart relaxes. If the heart was made of something more rigid, like how our pipes in our houses are, or a garden hose, there over time, those would start to leak or they would burst, right, from that continued pressure. But with this elasticity, it really allows the arteries to expand and contract with the pumping of blood. Okay. Veins are built for lower pressure flow, and veins are thinner walled because of that. They have a wider diameter. Blood travels back to the heart at a low velocity and pressure. There is lower pressure, more distant because they're more distant from the heart, especially if you think about blood returning from your toes all the way back into your heart. And blood must flow by skeletal muscle contractions when we move. And this is where it's squeezing blood through our veins. And that's why veins have valves, because if you think about fluid in any system moves from high concentration to a lower concentration. And so in our arteries, there's this really high pressure. It's moving the blood. And so as it gets used, as it travels through our body and it gets used, it moves through those capillary beds into the venules and into the veins. But really it's low pressure, right? So it's moving into those veins, which are low pressure, but it's really low pressure in those veins. So much, in fact, that if it wasn't for the valves, the blood, like if you're thinking about blood moving from your arteries into your arterioles, capillary beds, back into your venules, into your veins, all the way in your toes, there's not really enough pressure to bring that all the way back up to your heart. And so that's why the blood in the veins, especially that low, they'll flow up through muscle contractions, right? So when we move, the veins will be squeezed by muscles, and that will push the blood up towards the heart. And there are these valves that are in the veins that are these one-way valves that won't allow the blood to go backwards when our muscles relax. Okay, so when the valves stop working very well, then blood will flow backwards a little bit, or it will leak back a little bit, and that's when you get pooling of blood in your veins, and which are called varicose veins, as you can see there on the right. Okay, so capillaries are really the system that is built for exchange. They're very, very thin walls, okay, 1 cell thick, very thin. And they lack those 2 outer wall layers that you see in the veins and in the arteries. They only have an endothelium. So this really enhances exchange across capillaries by diffusion. And it's exchange between blood and other materials from cells. So nutrients go through here, proteins, waste, right? All kinds of things.
Just like you, in the next hour, over 1 million people will watch YouTube. But you could use this hour and start your business like these guys did. And now they're drinking their own.
Our circulatory system is designed to provide each of our cells with a type of diffusion exchange practiced by simple unicellular organisms living in aquatic environments. This exchange occurs at the level of the tiniest blood vessels, capillaries, where wastes, nutrients, gases, and hormones are exchanged between the blood and the body cells. With walls only a single cell thick, capillaries are well adapted to their role of exchange. Most nutrients, oxygen, and carbon dioxide diffuse readily through capillary cell membranes. Salts and small charged molecules, including some small proteins, move through fluid-filled spaces within the capillary cell membrane or between adjacent capillary cells. Pressure within capillaries causes a continuous leakage of fluid from the blood plasma into the spaces surrounding the capillaries and adjacent tissues. This fluid, known as interstitial fluid, consists primarily of water in which nutrients, hormones, gases, wastes, and small proteins from the blood are dissolved. The exchange of materials between capillary blood and nearby cells occurs through this interstitial fluid, which bathes nearly all the cells of the body. Capillaries are so narrow that red blood cells must pass through them in single file. Consequently, blood is sure to pass very close to the capillary walls. In addition, capillaries are so numerous that no body cell is more than 100 micrometers or 4/1000ths of an inch from a capillary. These factors facilitate the exchange of materials by diffusion. It is estimated that the total length of capillaries in a human is over 80,600 kilometers, or 50,000 miles. As blood is forced through this narrow, almost endless network of capillaries, the speed of blood flow drops very quickly, further enhancing diffusion by increasing the amount of time available for the blood and cells to exchange materials.
Okay, that brings us to the lymphatic system. Okay, this has to do with production and transport of white blood cells, which we know traps and potentially kills foreign invaders. And lymph vessels are intertwined amongst blood vessels. Okay, and this is an example of a lymph node, okay, which are periodically placed all throughout your body. Okay, so lymph, 10% of the fluid that doesn't diffuse back into capillaries enters lymphatic vessels, and it's allowed in, and it actually is prevented from leaving. And this is circulated through the squeezing of surrounding skeletal muscles, and it runs parallel to the circulatory system.
The lymphatic system. Lymph vessels are found in all tissues except the central nervous system, the bone marrow, and tissues without blood vessels such as cartilage. The lymph system vessels are extensive as the vessels of the circulatory system. The lymphatic system serves several functions. It controls fluid balance by draining and cleansing the fluids that leave the circulatory system to deliver nutrients and gases to the tissues. It interacts with the villi in the digestive system to absorb and deliver fats to the circulatory system. It also has an immunological protection from viruses, bacteria, fungi, and cellular debris that could damage the cells of the body. From your understanding of the circulatory system, you know that the blood passes through the arteries, arterioles, and then the capillaries. The capillary walls allow the fluid portion of the blood to exit the capillaries into the surrounding tissues. Once the fluid leaves the capillaries, it is called interstitial fluid. About 90% of this fluid will diffuse back into the capillaries because of the difference in concentrations of the fluid. However, about 10% of the fluid will enter the open-ended lymph vessels. Once the fluid has entered the lymph vessels, it's now called lymph. These vessels eventually deliver the lymph to locations where the lymph can be cleansed of debris and checked for the presence of pathogenic organisms. How it gets the lymph there is pretty amazing. There is no heart for this system of vessels to pump the lymph around. So how does the lymph get to the locations it needs to be delivered to? The lymph moves through your body when you move your skeletal muscles. The contraction of skeletal muscles squeezes the nearby lymph vessels, pumping them. This pushes lymph through the vessels. In addition to the contraction of skeletal muscles, there are two other means by which lymph travels through the lymphatic system. There are smooth muscles at the larger lymph vessels. The contraction of these smooth muscles adds to the force provided by the skeletal muscles. Also, When we breathe, pressure changes occur in the thoracic region. When the thoracic pressure drops, that tends to pull lymph into the thoracic duct. One-way valves prevent the lymph from flowing backwards. The function of fluid balance is seen best, perhaps, when it goes awry. When the lymphatic system is prevented from doing its job, the fluids build up in the tissues. Edemas is the term given to this medical condition. Mild edema can occur during pregnancy when the weight of the baby slows the ability of the vessels to move the lymph up the body. More serious levels of edema can occur in a tropical disease called elephantitis, in which a parasite blocks the vessels, and the edema that is produced looks a lot like having legs of an elephant. Some lymph tissue is very diffuse, with no clear boundaries. You can actually feel some when you rub your lower inner lip with your tongue. Others are more organized into groups, and these are called lymph nodes. Lymph nodes have three functions. First, they are testing stations. They monitor the blood by receiving samples of the blood plasma. Second, if the sample is rife with foreign invaders, they produce lymphocytes and send them into the bloodstream to try to destroy those invaders. In addition, the lymph nodes filter the lymph that they have so they can only return clean fluid back to the blood. Eventually, the lymph is returned to the circulatory system via the right and the left subclavian veins in the shoulders just above the heart level. Lymph nodules can be found as single structures in the body, or they can be grouped together in small clumps. That's what the tonsils are. They're groups of lymph nodules under the mucous membrane in the throat. These lymph nodules form a protective ring around the throat strategically located to protect the body from foreign invaders. If the tonsils get infected, they can become inflamed and abnormally enlarged, as you see here. This condition is called tonsillitis. If the condition is chronic, the tonsils can be removed in a tonsillectomy. Tonsils tend to get smaller as a person matures, and they can actually disappear altogether in an adult. Peyer's patches are very similar to tonsils. They are groups of lymphocytes and lymph nodules that are in the small intestines. Typically, they're found in the last third of the small intestine. Once again, they're strategically located to deal with foreign invaders. The lymphatic system's second function takes place here in the small intestine as well, the absorption of fats. We will discuss this more in depth in the topic of digestion, but for now, know that there are specialized lymph vessels called lacteals in the intestinal villi. These pick up fats that are released from digested food and absorb it into the villus tissue. The liquid in the vessels take on a milky color. Instead of being called lymph, this fluid is called chyle. The chyle eventually gets dumped in the subclavian vein, just like lymph. That is how the fats enter the circulatory system.
So blood flow in capillaries is controlled by pre-capillary sphincters. And the supply varies as blood is needed. So when sphincters are open, more blood is flowing. When sphincters are closed, there is restriction. After a meal, blood supply to digestive tract will increase, right? During strenuous exercise, blood will be diverted from the digestive tracts to the skeletal muscles. Capillaries in the brain, heart, kidneys, and liver are usually filled to capacity. So the exchange across capillary walls has to do with blood pressure and osmotic pressure. Okay. So when there's lymphatic capillary, okay, coming down, bringing lymph, and interstitial fluid is all around in between cells and in between capillary beds. Okay, you have your arteriole here with blood flow, oxygenated blood flow, and you have your venule with deoxygenated blood flow. And blood pressure, if the blood pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure, okay, then no. Okay, so exchange across capillary walls. Fluid and solutes flow out of capillaries to tissues due to blood pressure, okay, which is bulk flow. And interstitial fluid flows back into capillaries due to osmosis. And this is where plasma proteins increase osmotic pressure in the capillary. Okay, so let's watch this animation, and I'll just tell you now the animation is funny. It's recorded by a Canadian lady, and in Canada they say capillary, so you'll notice that.
Issues by diffusion. Capillary walls have tiny pores that allow water and small solutes to pass between the pores into and out of the blood vessel. The capillary walls do not allow proteins to pass through. Two forces control movement of fluid through the capillary wall. Blood pressure, which tends to cause water to move out of the capillary, and osmotic pressure, which tends to cause water to move into the capillary. At different locations in the capillary bed, the net forces will influence the direction of fluid movement. At the arterial end, blood is under high pressure because it has just come from the heart. Blood pressure is higher than osmotic pressure of the blood. Fluid is forced out of the blood, leaving solutes behind. This increases the solute concentration of the blood as fluid moves out of the blood. At the capillary end, blood pressure is relatively low because blood has been diverted from the arteriole to many capillaries. Osmotic pressure is relatively high. Solute concentration is still high because fluid has been pushed out into the tissues at the arterial end. What's left behind in the capillaries is a high concentration of solutes that includes salt, plasma proteins, and blood cells. Because osmotic pressure is higher than blood pressure, fluid moves back into the capillaries, and the blood becomes dilute once again. About 90% of the fluid that was pushed out due to hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end is brought back into the blood system at the venule end through osmotic pressure. The other 10% enters the lymphatic vessels, which eventually merge with the circulatory system so that the fluid is returned to general circulation. Midway along the capillary, where blood pressure is lower, the two forces, hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, essentially cancel each other out, and there's no net movement of water. Solutes now diffuse according to their concentration gradients. Nutrients like glucose and amino acids and oxygen diffuse out of the capillaries, and wastes like carbon dioxide diffuse into the capillaries. Red blood cells and almost all the plasma proteins remain in the capillaries. Only small substances leave. Here's another image of a capillary bed, which shows how extensive the lymphatic system is, which explains why it so effectively returns any tissue fluid that wasn't returned at the venous end. In this video, we've looked at capillary fluid exchange.
Okay, so again, 90% of the fluid that diffused out at the atrial end will return, and 10%, the 10% that's left, returns via the lymph. And again, this is all about the concentration of blood pressure to osmotic pressure. Okay, so when blood pressure is greater than osmotic pressure, then the fluid is diffusing out of the arteriole and out of those capillaries. And when the blood pressure is less than the osmotic pressure, then fluid rushes back in.